Yes, we just heard gunshots go off.
That pop, pop, and who knows how many gunshots were fired.
Bang, 1, 2, bang, bang.
Then I heard the shots, about 5 or 6 shots.
All I hear is sirens and then gunshots. I heard about 10 gunshots.
And all of a sudden we heard pop, 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 pop.
I just heard 4 gunshots.
Just the bang, bang, bang. I thought it was 3, but it's possibly 2, but I thought I heard 3 shots.
It was just a 3-round burst going pop, pop, pop.
And I heard about 5 gunshots. And
yeah, around 6 or 7 shots.
And all of a sudden we heard boom, boom, boom. I heard like 4 huge bangs. Boom, 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 boom.
Most of the shots were fired while the officer was running.
We can't tell you, as we have been for a little while now, that one police officer we know has been shot.
I am saddened to report that about 6:36 p.m. tonight, a Manchester police officer was shot in the line of duty. We're not releasing his name yet because we're trying to make sure that all of his family members are notified.
I laid there for approximately 1 to 2 minutes until the undercover officers were able to find me.
One of our officers was actually able to apply a tourniquet to the wound to control the bleeding.
Manchester police learned a few things about their own operation on that day, too. The chief says he really wishes they could have had more control over information as it was released to the press and to family members, but in this information age, he says that's pretty much impossible.
Everybody's been asking about the condition of Dan Doherty.
So let me just start off by saying that I visited Dan in the hospital. You all know Dan's story.
We were coming down in the elevator, we ran into Dan Doherty. How many of you know who Dan Doherty is?
The Medal of Valor is awarded to Officer Daniel Doherty.
Dean, we are in studio with Officer Dan Doherty, our Manchester Area Person of the Year. We're learning a little bit about him, and at the moment we're learning a little bit about that day. What happened?
There was a call for assistance over on the west side.
To help another officer, or was that a citizen call?
It was another officer. He's at undercover capacity.
Officer Dan Doherty was the first to arrive and spot the suspect on Rimmon Street. After a brief foot chase, Doherty got close enough to grab him.
You find the suspect. I'm assuming you pull over.
I observed a individual matching the description previously given out by the undercover officers.
Suspect is a male black.
About 5'10", white.
White or black male?
White.
White male, long hair.
I got a group of guys that need the description of this guy. Now we got 3 different descriptions.
I don't recall what he was wearing.
Hispanic male, about 18 to 20 years old. He was last seen wearing black clothing, afro-style haircut that was pulled back in a ponytail.
Police say the suspect description is very similar.
I don't remember exactly what the exact description was over the radio.
You know, firemen get to carry their equipment on the fire truck, but we have to wear it because you never know. We might have to jump out of the car and chase somebody. We have to have all our stuff accessible.
As a result, I rapidly also tried to stop, and while doing so, my feet began to slide forward from beneath me.
So you slid now. He must have had his gun in hand when he turned.
You know, believe it or not, he didn't.
Really?
God, I don't see a gun.
March 21st, 6:38 p.m. A plainclothes detective calls for uniformed backup to Bridge and Amory Street.
Just saw 2 Hispanic males.
That a group of 3 white males were seen leaving the area.
Would you mind just standing up and just showing the jury what you were wearing? And just tell us what's on your uniform. Just point out a few things.
I have clear indications of a police officer, such as badge, other pins, duty belts with obvious weaponry and tools that a police officer carries.
This belt weighs 23 pounds.
Now, I was looking at that thing. I'm sure you'll figure out where to put the batteries when it needs to go, but right now I can tell you it's ticking. Just to show you how handy I am.
We carry a radio. I consider a radio the most important piece of equipment I'm carrying, more than my gun. What kind of weapon were you carrying that day?
A 6-hour.
6 hour.
6 hour. 6 hour.
6 hour.
6 hour. 6 hour. 6 hour.
6 hour.
6 hour.
6 hour.
6 hour 1. It's XM17 modular handgun system competition.
It is among the most popular handguns for sale today, a favorite among law enforcement.
An officer had accidentally discharged his weapon
into his right leg.
Would I believe that my gun would just shot me?
What kind of weapon were you carrying that day?
A 6-hour .226 40 caliber.
Explain to me how a gun goes off getting out of the car.
He accidentally shot himself.
The 6-hour is the most dangerous pistol sold in the United States market. The gun fired on its own while it was holstered.
6-hour has known for years that this gun is susceptible to unintended discharge.
A shot was fired from one of the officer's handguns, which struck another officer.
A gun went off while an officer stepped out of his car.
6-hour says it is not liable for injuries a Troy police detective suffered.
I heard a loud bang and I felt a searing hot pain in my right thigh. I was scared. I was very scared because I thought someone had shot at me.
I felt excruciating pain in my shin and heard the shot, a shot.
100 incidents across the country.
After claiming his gun fired when it fell to the ground, still in its holster.
A law enforcement officer's gun reportedly firing on its own.
But in the long run, I'll be right back to where I was. I'll be playing hockey again.
Doherty spent Thursday afternoon practicing with the UNH Wildcats.
I said, I gotta get in touch with the governor because he made a promise to me and I need to remind him.
What kind of weapon were you carrying that day?
So we just finished the case, but we have another gunshot wound that's coming in. Being brought in by police.
The bullets of justice.
It's all confidential.